Well, welcome and thank you again for joining us. My name is Kristen Deal. I'm the Director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at DU. It is really an honor to facilitate this discussion and engage with these wonderful colleagues here. Just as a reminder, the title for our time together today is LGBTQIA+ community and the intersectionality of our histories. Before we begin, it is important to acknowledge that the University of Denver occupies the ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. In its own history, this land has been the living and hunting grounds of many peoples and was taken by force and through brutal means. We must recognize and mourn this loss and seek to both understand and attend to these complex and painful histories. Today, we'll explore the multifaceted and intersectional histories of our LGBTQ+ community. And in this conversation, grounded in inclusion and equity, and in the many that have come before it, and in the many that will come after it, these should always be held in tension with our history of exclusion and colonialism. So from there, I want to take a moment and introduce our panelists, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Rika Ruiz is a third year here at DU and is studying sociology and computer science. They are a current president of QSA, or the Queer Student Alliance, and they plan to continue supporting and advocating for marginalized communities after college. Dong Din serves as the program coordinator for Access and Transitions team in Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence. He graduated from DU in 2019 with a master's degree in higher education and is currently pursuing an EDD. He actually just passed his comp, so that's huge. He identifies as a queer Vietnamese American and concentrates his research in supporting historically underrepresented students with a specialty focus on Asian American populations. He is also the co-chair of Queer University Employees, or the group known as Q. Dr. Catherine Smith is a professor and the Chauncey G. Wilson Memorial Research Chair at the Sturm College of Law at DU. Dr. Smith joined the faculty at the University of Denver in 2004 and teaches torts, employment discrimination, family law, and sexuality, gender, and the law. Her research interests include civil rights law and critical race theory. In addition, Dr. Smith co-authored an amicus brief on the constitutional rights of children that was cited in Obergefell versus Hodges, the landmark United States Supreme Court case on same-sex marriage. So thank you all for joining us. Again, we'll get going. If you have questions, please feel free to get those in the Q&A, and we'll continue to filter those in as we go. All right. So let's get going. One of the things that I think a lot about is about history, and this is LGBTQ+ History Month, which some may think is actually in June, right? I think a lot of folks potentially confuse or overlap June being Pride Month and October being LGBTQ+ history. But this month in particular is meant to help us focus our attention on the many histories, her stories, and their stories that have helped pave the roads to where we are today. So I'm going to start by asking our panelists, do you have a bit of LGBTQ+ history? This could be a person, a place, a happening that has been important to your own story. And if so, if you would mind sharing.
Yeah, I can jump in first. Hey everyone, Dong Din. When I think about my important history, right, situating my identity with being a queer Asian American, I think about those who have been brave to be on public television or be in public news sources, right? So George Takei has been a pretty big one for me, just because with being Asian American, my family, right, we have complications of being queer in the family. So seeing representation within the Asian American queer identity on screen has been amazing. Particularly when right, I grew up on the interweb, right? So YouTube was another place where I can seek places where I felt seen. So Eugene Lee Yang of Try Guys has been another place for me to explore my identity and disrupt heteronormative um, binary places of what gender and sexuality means. Right, so that has been fantastic, as well as looking through this question and researching a little bit. I realized that queer history has been, or specifically for Asian American, has been rendered invisible throughout the years. But I was looking through Google and found an article that counts, right, dates and um, have records of Asian Americans um, in the 1800s and 1900s being seen and having their histories being as queer and trans. So that was fantastic to read too.
Other folks.
I can go. I think I was a theater kid in high school, not to perpetuate stereotypes or anything. So performing was a big part of my life and coming to terms with my identity. But I was doing like a lot more research on like Black history in high school. So I had to come to terms a lot with the fact that the theater hasn't been very kind to Black people, especially considering just how much of our modern day pop culture is influenced even by minstrelsy. So I guess sort of in terms of sort of coping with that, I think inspiring figures such as music. Music was a big part of my life. So seeing how much of modern contemporary music was actually influenced by the Black community, specifically the Black queer community, was super inspiring. I think figures like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith just being like the figureheads of blues, and other Black queer lesbians who started rock music, genres that today are considered like white music, but were like ones I enjoyed, and that sort of made me feel isolated from the community. But come to find out, it was our people doing who made this music and who and really that I feel like I'm taken back. So I think seeing Black figures who are like so inspired to just be who they were at such a I guess it's still a hostile time, but even back then when he was more hostile, arguably, to be out and to be Black and to be queer and to stand up and say, I deserve not just basic dignity, but to be celebrated and to perform. And I think that's helped me rethink how I see myself and my self value.
So I think for me, I don't, it's really amazing to hear these different stories. And for me, I think of just the unnamed people who were courageous and out throughout the course of just my coming out process, and, not really even having an idea early on in my youth, and coming across people, just everyday people who had the courage and, to be out, and just seeing and having an interaction with that person, because during that time period, people weren't out. I mean, people still aren't out now, but during that time in particular, well before same-sex marriage, really well before the movement was really prevalent in the popular culture. And so those folks to me are sort of these unspoken heroes, and people that had families, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then connected to those families. I have to say, I think the group of people that get overlooked are not just the activists, but lawyers, the just small practice, 1-2 person shop lawyers who did so much in LGBTQ family law. And, we talk a lot about marriage, and of course it was based off the Constitution, but these folks were thinking of creative ways to protect LGBTQ people and families, just everyday person walk into their practice, and they're thinking of ways to try and protect their families, protect their sexual identities, protect their gender identity. And so those are the folks I really think of.
Listening to these moments, I'm thinking about a lot of things, right? This brings up a lot for me in terms of the ways in which identity is complex. It's multifaceted, it's overlapping, it's temporal in some moments, but it's intersectional at the very core of who we are as unique individuals, right? And so not just the ways in which, when we're trying to find ourselves in history, when we're trying to find the folks who have gone before us, right? Like the giants whose shoulders we're standing on, that is at a crossroads with race, with gender, with occupation, right? And so the ways in which we dive into, Dr. Smith, kind of your thoughts there around law. I've thought about that in terms of education and higher education in particular, which is kind of my area, but the ways in which folks who do their everyday work and engage in their everyday living are maybe the most prevalent liberators for us, right? Because it's not just the ways in which we see them on screen or the ways in which they're out in front of a parade, but it's the ways in which we watch them live their lives and make sense of, like, oh, that's how we do those things, or that's a way to make sense of how I can move in that argument and find my space. But to Dong's point, right, like, it's also important to have these folks who are out in front, right, out in a lot of ways, but out in front, and engaging in these conversations from a comedic space, from a argumentation space, from a theater music space, to help us make sense. One of the things, though, that leads me to, in terms of kind of how we make sense of these things, right, is the ways in which that intersectionality, what some people might say is part of the very acronym, right, that we use, LGBTQIA plus, or however you engage in that acronym, gives both space for creating of community and shared experience, right? We that acronym itself can bound or can provide some parameters around closeness. And yet also it could end up essentializing experiences that are very different. What are the experiences of, Dr. Smith, to your space? Like, what are the experiences of white, gay men who have children versus a trans couple, right? And so we may end up essentializing very different experiences. So then I wonder if in that essentializing, we are losing important bits of information. We're losing important lenses upon the community. Things are being erased. And so I wonder if you all could speak to what has been glossed over from your either personal or professional lives, the things that you've experienced. What are areas of thought, engagements, things that we have missed, that we have lost in our telling and retelling of history over time?
So I'll hop in and just say, from a law kind of legal standpoint, that's really related to the questions you're raising, Kristen, in a very gracious way that you put it. I think that marriage itself was one of those issues. From an intersectional perspective, there were a lot of members of the community who felt like marriage wasn't and should not have been the priority for the LGBTQI movement. And the critique of that is that it was that was a priority for those who, that's what they felt like was important, whereas other people felt like, well, there's violence against LGBTQI folks of color, there's employment issues, there's housing, there are a lot of issues that we could address as a movement. And so I think that the heart of what we choose and prioritize, or what it's put out in the public, is contested and has intersectional consequences. And so I just flagged that and I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think that's an example of that. And when we look at where we are today, some would say, well, marriage was very successful and has opened up a lot of avenues for us, while others would say, but we still aren't protected, fully under the equal protection or the 14th Amendment, under substantive due process or equal protection. yet. So people can still be fired, people can still be denied housing, and not have a federal, at least maybe state law, but not be protected in the federal law or constitutional law. And we're still working that out. And so I think just that alone, and where we go and what we choose as a global movement or as a national movement, and how it gets prioritized, has these very real intersectional consequences. And now that we have marriage, are those same people who push for it behind us on, okay, now we have time to pursue these other things, and are you on board with us? So I'll stop there.
And we'll talk about those other things here probably in a little bit. I'm going to take note of that. But Rika and Dong, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I can tackle this one. So it makes me so this question makes me think of some of the items that have happened in the past year, whether it be protests of supporting Black lives, the Olympics, right? Those who can come out or be out, depending on politics of their own country, whether that's like, hey, like the U.S. we can come out, but other countries who condemn being queer can have the death penalty, right? So when I take a look at this from the personal side of things, right, I think of those who cannot be there or have died of consequences through brutality and violence when understanding this community, right, as well as dominant discourses that have attributed this community, like white gay men holds the power in this community. I will say that, right? So being Asian American and gay, situated in this community, it's hard to find community. But what I see in the current context is, right, there has been more embrace. I guess there has always been an embrace of people of color, Black indigenous individuals, as well as other racial identities that have held spaces in celebration for each other, right? And we're seeing that in more of the social media. We're seeing this in Netflix shows, right? And maybe those aren't the reality, but representation in those spaces help us understand history a little bit, but also help us examine critically of how do we essentialize dominant discourse within the acronym, right? And who is left out. And in my professional spaces, right, I support students all the time, and more of them are racially minoritized or first generation students. So even the intersection within those, navigating in spaces of higher education has been tough for students, right? Not knowing where to go, how to come out to parents, not even coming out to parents, discussions on, right, I'm Black and queer, but I don't fit within this dominant discourse, or this, I don't see myself represented here in this university of student groups, right? So having discussions on those and trying to provide situations and resources where I'm not the expert, right, but I can help guide them to some of identity and politics and readings that help affirm who they are.
Yeah, I think there are other people here who are more qualified than I am to talk about the academic side of intersectionality. So on a more personal experience level, whenever I always think about my experiences and my story, I at least when it comes to gender and sexual identity, I think my story is really complete without talking about my racial identity and how really for a long time, I think I felt more comfortable with my gender and sexual identity than I did with my racial identity. Just because growing up as, a feminine Black boy, I think I felt more isolated from the Black community. So I think, and just the narratives of how, predominant LGBT culture was centered around white people. And so I felt like I never really fit in with the community of color. And I think that's a narrative I'm still working on trying to subvert, because I know it's not necessarily true. I am who I am on all pieces and forms. So I guess the question I feel like I'd ask even like white gay men is to ask themselves, like, how has being white affected your gender or sexual identity? And how has that impacted your story in a way that either perpetuates narratives, counters narratives, or whether you think your story is your own?
Rika, I appreciate you kind of relocating us a little bit there, right? There are a variety of ways that we can think about these things. And so I'll just step in for a moment. As a white queer woman, who is in a marriage with another white queer woman, we think a lot about kind of what does our whiteness buy us, right? What is the currency of our whiteness, both within and outside of the queer spaces? And it's ripe. There's a ton of it, right? And so how does that impact the ways that we have to show up at an intersectional level for our community? At the same point, at what ways does that mean that we have to work, and what are our commitments to work against anti-racist practice in our white communities, right? And the ways in which we engage in those spaces. And it's not to say that we've made sense of that. But I do think that yes, those intersectional spaces and the ways in which the performative and productive ways that whiteness, for lack of a better way to say it, bleeds into all of our identities, noting that intersectionality as a term started in the legal space, so Dr. Smith can speak much better to this than I can, but started at the nexus of race, right? So that we start there and then we think out. And so what is the importance for us in queer spaces as white people to decenter white performances of sexuality as a way of creating anti-oppressive spaces, I think is a really important conversation that has to be had. So I appreciate that thinking there. I want to kind of double click on a couple things that were shared in the ways in which, even in what we may seek as queering space, right, or queering the locations in which we exist, we may inadvertently or inadvertently renormalize dominant spaces. And so, Dr. Smith, you spoke a little bit to this about kind of how the ways in which we, by choosing particular agendas or priorities, we are thereby bound up in the ways that those things have been defined previously. So what are ways that if we are to shift our attention, right, we're to shift our gaze, we could create spaces of more equitable practice or more equitable engagements across kind of across our own LGBTQ plus community, but also across communities that are also bound up by those normative conversations?
For me, I think, the intersectionality is in sort of how power operates. Is sort of how I ended up in my writing about the rights of kids. And I wrote an article called Queer as Black Folk, and it was an article about the comparisons of civil rights to LGBT rights. And it's an older article. It was a while ago. It was before the marriage, well before Obergefell. And it really was a critique of those comparisons to try and bring people together, because what it does is send people into their categories in their minds, sort of psychologically speaking. And then you never really can get to beyond that, because people are entrenched in their in groups, and recognizing that there are people at the intersections of those groups. And of course, that's how I ended up sort of thinking about it, was to say, maybe there's a way for us to think of what I kind of talked about as outsider interest convergence, where we come together and look at different marginalized groups or communities, and kind of talk about how we have a common interest. And one of those common interests for me was, when it came to the LGBT rights movement and race, was people at the intersections. If a white person said to my mom, well, you should support gay rights, my mom, who's African American, you should support gay rights because it's the same as civil rights, she's not going to buy that as an 85-year-old Black woman who grew up in the rural segregated South Carolina, and was educated by Q, wasn't allowed to go to school anywhere for most of her years until she was in high school. And so, her and my dad were educated in a church by Pew and taught by their relatives because of segregation. She's not going to hear that coming from a white gay guy. But if the person said, but these rights are important for your daughter who's Black and gay, she might at least have an open window to talk about that and say, okay, well, now I'm hearing you, because we have a common interest there in terms of that. And so that's how I ended up talking about kids, because the stereotypes about LGBTQ families and about, and you'll see it in a dissent by Justice Scalia, is that gay people are white, predominantly white and male, and are fluent. And the reality is that that's just it's not accurate. And as you all know, and we all know, and when it comes to kids, more than half of the couples, same-sex couples raising kids, are raising kids of color over the age of 8. Who are raising kids over the age of 18. I'm sorry, who are raising kids under the age of 18 are kids of color. And that was really compelling to me, because it was right at the intersection of a lot of categories. And so that's what compelled me to write about the rights of kids and to write the amicus briefs in Windsor and Obergefell, and felt like the other interest lineup of convergence would be, well, surely these folks making this decision, sitting on the Supreme Court, may not know what it means to be LGBTQ. They may not know what it means to be Black. There aren't their lived experiences, but they certainly can understand what it means for a kid to be denied rights or treated unequally. And I'm not saying that's the only answer, it's the only way, but that's how I got there in terms of thinking about from an intersectional perspective. And it's not just about LGBT rights. For me, this is an agenda about lots of areas, but that's how I ended up, was this through this intersectional lens. So.
I'm gonna, there's a ton in there that I want to go ahead and at some point, Dr. Smith, I'm going to take you out to coffee and we're gonna have a conversation. But there's a piece of that I think I may be reading incorrectly here, so I'll know that, but I think is actually implicit in the four of us here today. So I'm going to kind of try and pull that thread a little bit. Generational intersectionality in the ways in which we engage in these spaces and the way that we embody these spaces, right? So I'm almost 40. I live in a particular generation that is also at the intersections of my race and gender and sexuality and all of those things. And I think that we all, the four of us, exist at different spaces, right? Maybe not generationally, but the ways in which generations and the reading of generations matters. So I wonder for each of us, the ways in which we may understand and think about what the growths or the successes or the wins, I'm not sure how you want to think about that, of the LGBT community. What have they been from your location? And then maybe we can come back to it, but you can start thinking about what are from your location, the potential areas of next struggle, or maybe even the potential areas of loss of rights that we may be feeling, right? That may be part of our affective space at the moment.
I could talk about my space. I think talking about the generational intersectionality, I think it's really interesting to see how the LGBTQ population, student population on campus has been like growing on like an exponential level. And I think that's not to say that like there's more LGBT people, just like in regards to like maybe like survival bias and how maybe it's becoming more comfortable and that's why people feel, there's a lot of factors, but that's to say that I think we're doing when it comes to my work as the leader of Queer Student Alliance, I think I find value in that we're working towards creating spaces where people can come to and feel safe. Um, and just so I don't take credit from this idea, this is a conversation I've been having with other administrators, but the idea that like we should be making more space, we should be doing more effort to make LGBT students feel more comfortable on across the entire campus. So it's not just a question of like, where can I go to feel safe? It's a question of it's being able to say I feel comfortable no matter where I am on campus. I know there are people supporting me who will respect me and my dignity, who I can go to if something goes wrong, and things like that, making the whole environment feel comfortable, not just pockets on campus.
Yeah, when I reflect on this question, Kristen, it's a hard question. But when I reflect on this this question as relates to generation, I'm a millennial, so I've seen newspapers and MySpace and Zanga, if y'all remember that, all the way into like TikTok, right? We see all these YouTube and TikTok opportunities to engage further. So no, exposure has been significantly more so that I've seen in the past because I'm not reading a newspaper on violence and crime rates against LGBTQI individuals. Yes, we are still seeing that to this present day, and we got to name those who have been faced with violence. But at the same time, with TikTok, right? Even though I'm a little older than the TikTok generation right now, TikTok has been an amazing space for advocacy, for visibility, for celebration, even tips and tricks for the younger generation to teach each other, right? To ask questions about themselves or to engage further of like, why are we doing the things that we're doing right now? And we can further understand each other in different ways. I've been immersed in academics in the last couple of years, right? I have seen more and more academic articles, opinions from higher education websites, right, on trans issues, on queer issues, on intersectional issues as relates to this community. Yes, they're still need work to be done, right? There's always work to be done, but I think there's visibility to help us understand our praxis in terms of developing students or academics or identity um, helps us understand the broader context of what we have here in higher education to society, right? And also understanding that college is for most students, right, an opportunity for them to first step into a world that they haven't experienced in, right? Whether that's being queer, whether that's intersectional identities, racial identities, right? So higher education can offer those spaces, but we need to make those spaces and right, make those spaces with those who have experiences in this.
I think this is such an important question, the intergenerational piece of it. And I think the key in, for me, what I'm experiencing is the younger generations pushing me on questions and issues and thinking about these questions and ideas a different way. And that's been really amazing. And I think it requires trust in that space. Who's having that conversation, between generations or among generations really requires trust so we can hear each other. And I have a 17-year-old daughter, and she's a big fan of Young M.A. And we spend a lot of time in the car talking about, her music, what she's listening to, what I'm listening to, and our conversations about Young M.A. as a queer hip hop artist really sparked a lot about gender and about sexuality and about feminism. And we ended up co-authoring a chapter in a hip hop book about it. She's a creative writer at the Denver School of the Arts. And, I learned so much in that process from her. But it's because we trust each other in terms of what we're saying to each other. Hopefully she learned from me as well, from my generation's perspective. But I think that's really key, is that trust with and among all of us who are having these conversations. And I really trust my students when they come to me and say, hey, you know, this is really important, and we feel like this is language we should be using, or we need this space, dedicated space, and we need you to hear us on that. And so I think, you know, trust in relationships just goes such a long way, as opposed to what the substance is, for us to move forward and trying to think about how we're going to sort of evolve collectively together and have a sense of belonging.
I'm going to try and bring all three together because it's swirling in my head, but I have a very close colleague here at DU who challenged us in a meeting the other day to pay attention to these spaces, right? To the phone, right? To our virtual spaces, because those are the spaces in which our students are living. And Dong, to your point, making sense of themselves and of each other. And there is sometimes in the more, what I might call more stuffy academic spaces, where we actually find some clout in not being engaged in those spaces. And yet, Catherine, to your point, part of, I think, trust building is showing interest. It's actually being engaged. It's being curious. It's asking questions. Rika, it's having, it's the administration having, and I'm part of the administration, so I'll just say that, right? I've got to be part of that. Not resting on students to say, what is the next space you need, but actually starting all conversations with, what would safety look like across the institution at all points in time? And some of that means that we have to engage from a variety of generational levels to build that trust. We have to engage from a variety of generational levels so that students aren't saying, well, yeah, I brought that idea up and it's great and it's been a success, but they just show up on campus and they're like, wow, that thing just exists. I never had to ask for it, think about it, it just was. Dean Spade talks about this as trickle up social justice, that if higher education, and I'll use that as the location of interest here, since that's where we're all located. If we thought about the creation of all spaces, so curricular, research, actual physical spaces, if we thought about it from what do we need to do in this space so that the most minoritized population feels belonging and included, if we start with that question, it's a universal design approach. It says, if we start at the most marginalized level and create a space of belonging there, it will be good for all people. It will feel holistic to all people. It will feel life-giving to all people. And I wonder if generationally, that's a space where we could think across generations to say, what does the youngest generation feel like from what we know? And what are they telling us? Are we listening? Are we building trust to do that? And then on the flip side, what have the older generations experienced? What part of our reality is our reality because of that generation, and how do we interact in those spaces? But I do appreciate this kind of conversation around the ways in which maybe a felt generational divide could actually be like a great nexus for growth, especially in the LGBTQ community. I'm gonna have to keep thinking on that, but I appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and shift, and this may feel like a hard shift, but we've been talking kind of all over the space, and we are situated at DU, and so I wonder if we could situate this part of our conversation at DU. So we all occupy different locations. We've been here for probably different amounts of time. We will be here for different amounts of time. But from your location, however you want to frame that, how have your experiences at DU provided you with moments of reflection or moments of engagement? And then make the jump for us. So how might those things inform future practice? How might those things inform different pedagogies? How might those things inform new buildings or whatever that is?
I can tackle this one first. So I'm the co-chair of the Queer University Employees Group, or Q, as we said. I think coming into DU, I wasn't really exploring my identity within the queer community, but then over time, shout out to Jasmine Post for situating the need for this group over the years. I think that this group has really helped me not only be part of a community, but see that there's value in diverse experiences as well, whether it's racial, whether it's gender, sexuality, whether it's being challenged on terms and definitions over the years. This group has provided me with a moment to just escape, right, from heteronormative structures and systems that exist in higher education. It allowed me to exist and be me. With that said, right, other folks have different experiences, and right, while this group is pretty new, I think we, with the help of SOCA, we've utilized their structure to create, or in the process of creating bylaws, as well as structure for the longevity of it, right? Whether that's co-chair, other positions that can really elevate this group. And right, we're hoping to connect to students and alumni community within this group to help inform our practice.
I'm comfortable going next. As president of Queer Student Alliance, I've strongly valued I guess it's more of a responsibility than an honor, but I really do value the work I get to do, especially considering how much I get to work with other affinity orgs and how inspired really I feel that other leaders have this mindset of intersectionality and wanting to work together for similar causes. I think more specifically, the Indigenous advocacy in our community feels very empowering. And I think it's also helps to sort of decenter ourselves in the sense that like it's not just, I'm not working with just this specific subsection of the queer community at DU, but I should, in all my work, I need to consider as many people as I can to make my events as accessible as they can be. And I think it's really inspiring how working with other groups has led to that. And I think being open to diverse perspectives has really helped encourage me to check my blind spots, see where I need to work on myself. Because I don't have the answers. None of us have the answers, but it's cool that I feel like I have a community that's I guess constructive, and we're working to push each other to be better.
I think they're hard questions to answer from a personal lens because it's hard to disaggregate what's gender, what's sexuality, what's race. I have a hard time with that. I don't know a lot of times, and somebody who defaults. I really love what Rika was saying about how they how they experience their identity, and it was really interesting because it was in contrast to what I was thinking for myself, which is I always default race. That's where I'm coming from because it's just so prevalent and so visible. That not that I think it's race discrimination or whatever's happening to me, but I definitely, race is so central in my identity as opposed to gender and sexuality in some ways, but it's also hard to disaggregate sometimes. I think we're certainly not in the space anymore at DU, at least in the law school. I can't speak to the whole campus, where when I first interviewed, I guess about 18 years ago, and I was pregnant and with my daughter, and I'd left after the interview, and one of the faculty asked what my husband did, and the faculty member didn't tell him because they were worried they wouldn't vote for me. I don't think we're there anymore, and I'm not saying that to misalign, like say anything negative about people, but there's a lot of growth, and we grow over time, and we evolve, and we're all getting educated and learning, and I think we're in a different space. But also as a plaintiff in a lawsuit that sued the University of Denver for gender discrimination and pay inequality, I think it's just hard. It's difficult, and these are hard issues, and they're hard topics. And I think we learned a lot from that lawsuit. And I think DU's, looking to find its way and figure this out, and says the right things and is committed to doing this. And I think there are people internally who are committed to doing it, but I think we have to continue to push. But to those here that are the people pushing, I do want to say that, it's not our job to solve those problems either. And the self-care and self-preservation is super critical. And I'm happy to have that conversation with any of you after 20 years of being in a predominantly white institution. I mean, and so I think it's complex, and it's contextual, and it's situational. And I have great colleagues. I have people I love on my faculty. I have challenges, in different contexts. And so it's not a cheery narrative, and it's not a downer narrative. It's just that it's a progress. And as individuals in it, we have to sort of decide for ourselves, pick our battles, and decide for ourselves what makes the most sense for us in engaging in these sorts of pursuits to have the rhetoric or the language of who we say we are match what we do. And it's always going to be evolving, I think, because the power shifts and changes. So that's how I think about these issues, and from a big picture perspective.
We're getting close to time, so I'm going to have one more question. But if anybody in the audience has a question, try and get it in, and I'll try and get it in front of the group. So I think I'm going to hit on the fact that, like, I do feel from my location that things they shift at any point in time, from a local administrative level to a national administrative level to to Dong's comment early on around how do we engage in global issues around these things. And so there is some notion, I think, that we may feel like we have gains at one point and some stability, and then feel like the rug is gone from underneath us within just a short amount of time. And that hits back on Dr. Smith, something that you just shared in terms of those locations of self-care or community care. What are those things that ground us, that help us find stable spaces? And so you can I'm going to let everybody, depending on kind of where you feel comfortable, take this question in two different ways. So as we're shortening up on time, either share kind of your thoughts on how folks may find those locations of self-care or respite, or if you want to go in a different direction, what would you say to folks listening to this, or folks that could potentially listen to this, in terms of what moments of advice or wisdom would you give in terms of how we continue in these struggles toward those moments of liberation?
I mean, I think one thing I'd say is it's really important to recognize that we have agency. Nothing's happening to us in terms of our decisions on this campus of what we want to do. We get to decide for ourselves, and not to remove that agency from ourselves. And the other thing for me right now is thinking about, how do I engage that's not about the issues that are my own individual struggles or identity? How do I use my power and privilege and access, and share it with those who might not have that power, privilege, and access? And it's not necessarily about race or sexuality or gender or whatever it may be. So those are things I'm chewing on now, and feel like are really important.
Yeah, along the lines of that, I think DU is situated in a space where silentness is more prevalent than other spaces, right? Siloness is reality here, and so when spaces or events and engagement happens, it's usually the same folks showing up, like this webinar or Indigenous Peoples Day event, right? It's the same folks showing up. So I challenge our colleagues here on this call to bring a friend, to 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 bring them to a space that they may not be comfortable in, or want to learn more about, right? Because it's the same thing. We see the same colleagues over and over doing the same work and struggle, and that gets tiring, right? So going back to this notion of self-care, right? Sometimes we just have to sit back and understand that we can't do this alone. So we need that power, and we need that community aspect to break these silos, to be able to, right, um, to make communities and bonds, because we're part of the larger society, right? We can't just be situated here in our siloness in higher education.
I guess the thing of value I wanted to share has more to do with, oh, sorry. I think what I wanted to share has more to do with the self-care part, and I guess the conversations I've been having with other student leaders and how, and just my friends in general, really, because we all consider ourselves like radical leftists. We want to change the world and like advocate for ourselves and like fight the administration and everything. And it's like, and like I don't think any of those are really like bad initiatives or something, but I think we feel a lot of pressure to sort of get everything done within the 4 years that we're here, give or take. And that if we didn't completely flip the system by the time we leave, we feel a little bit disappointed. So I guess not in the sense like we feel pressure and that we need to lower expectations or something, but it's like understanding that like we feel a lot of burdens on us, and I think we're trying to work to really see self-care and like taking care of ourselves as a form of advocacy, and that destroying ourselves isn't really worth it. So I think that's also a part of the conversations that the youth are having.
I so appreciate all of those, and they do, I think, stream together in some really important ways. I think, Dr. Smith, to your point, there's a book. It's a little dated now, but it's a good read called Other People's Children, by Lisa Delpit, and it makes the argument that if we started to think about the decisions we're making in particular, a policy level, ready? If we started to think about the impacts of those things on other people's children, not just our own, we would start to see the world differently, and we would actually start to engage differently in spaces, because we would realize that communities of care are more important in the long run of the health of ourselves as well. And so there's interconnectedness. For me, that streams into your space of the like, as students, I remember a while ago when I was a student, right? But the notion that to sacrifice yourself on the altar there could sacrifice other things, your academics, your well-being, your health, your mental health. And so at what points do you find respite? In what ways do you as a community and as a person remind yourselves of your whole being, right? The body, the spirit, the physical nature of the body. And so also hoping at some point that people are looking out for you, right? That other people, Dr. Smith, other faculty, other staff are also thinking about what are the communities of care that we're building, so that the experiences you have as a student and other students have are not the same experiences that students in 5 or 10 or 15 years will have. And Dong, this leads me back to kind of your space around thinking, kind of thinking in the both and, right? Having to exist in a multitude of spaces so that we engage in those spaces of both self-belonging for ourselves and creating belonging for other people. I found today to be so a gift to to me from the three of you. And so I appreciate just you sharing and your engagements. And I do hope that for the audience and whoever watches this beyond has some takeaways. I think that sitting down and writing down taking the next 5 minutes and writing down a few things that have stuck with you so that your own practices and beliefs can change and can become more robust, can be deepened by the beautiful lives of these people here. And so I push you to do that. I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Chase, but also thank my three colleagues here today.
Thank you all so much. A huge shout out to Kristen, Catherine, Dong, and Rika. Thank you so much for being in the space and sharing your stories and experiences. We're honored to hear them. And Community Plus Values will continue to work in partnership with Heritage Months to honor and celebrate the different identities of folks who make up our campus, and just to continue to try to make this institution a place of greater belonging and inclusion. And so we do encourage folks. I shared some resources that are from the panelists about different articles that Catherine has written about Q and about QSA. So we encourage you to visit those pages, and that's a great way to learn more, take action, and get involved and build that community and support system. I also will share in the chat that you can visit Heritage Month's website, and that will have information about upcoming events as well, and other things that are going on for each Heritage Months. And then finally, we will have another special edition C+V community talk next week about the veteran experience in Afghanistan and what that looks like. And we're working in partnership with the GSPP Military Psychology Program faculty, Veteran Services, and so many campus partners. And so we encourage you to join us for that special edition webinar. And if you're looking to get involved or share anything, please follow C+V on our social media channels. Always feel free to email us at community+values, plus spelled out, at du.edu, or visit our website. And again, we just thank you, all three panelists, and Kristen for facilitating this webinar today. We will have a recording of this webinar available for folks who couldn't make it today. We know what it's like in the virtual world, and so we will share that on our website, and we encourage you to watch that on YouTube, and that will be available in the coming days. But thank you all so much again. We truly appreciate it, and have a great rest of your week, and practice that self-care that we were just talking about. Thank you all.